The year is 2010. The Saints were finally on top of the football world. After decades of mostly irrelevance, they captured their first Super Bowl championship in franchise history, defeating the Colts in Miami behind the spotless play of Drew Brees and the aggressive play calling of Sean Payton. But the road back would run through a loaded NFC. After one of the most remarkable seasons of his career in 2009, it was confirmed Brett Favre would be returning for one final run with the Vikings, who had just lost the NFC Championship to the Saints in the Bounty Bowl. Adrian Peterson was in his prime, and Rookie of the Year Percy Harvin was looking like one of the most electric players in the NFL. But at 40 years old and coming off ankle surgery, the question was just how long Favre could hold up. Meanwhile, it was clear Aaron Rodgers was already one of the most talented QBs in the league, and now the roster around him was taking shape. But no team entered this season under more pressure than the Cowboys, who had the opportunity to host the Super Bowl in their own stadium, with Tony Romo coming off arguably his best season yet and the league's second-ranked defense from 2009. But the Eagles had moved on from Donovan McNabb, trading the 34-year-old QB in division to the Redskins, and the plan was to hand the offense to Kevin Kolb, a young quarterback with limited experience but plenty of optimism. And sitting behind him was Michael Vick, still trying to rebuild his career after years away from the game. At the time, he was viewed as a wildcard backup and nothing more. And in the AFC, the Colts were still the standard. Despite their Super Bowl loss, as long as Peyton Manning was under center, anything under 10 wins was unacceptable. But of course, you could say the same thing about the Patriots. Even with Randy Moss announcing this would be his final season in New England, Tom Brady was ready to bounce back after an ugly wildcard loss in January. The Steelers, however, would have to navigate early adversity with Ben Roethlisberger suspended for the first 4 games of the year. But with Troy Polamalu and James Harrison anchoring the defense, Pittsburgh wasn't going anywhere. And fresh off an AFC Championship appearance with the Jets, head coach Rex Ryan certainly wasn't lacking confidence. With the league's top defense, a dominant O-line, and a young Mark Sanchez, they fully embraced the Hard Knocks spotlight. Elsewhere in the AFC, 3 of the league's premier wideouts would be donning new uniforms in 2010. Anquan Boldin traded to Baltimore, Brandon Marshall to Miami, and the NFL's active career receiving leader Terrell Owens having signed a 1-year deal with the Bengals. But the Raiders embraced the principle of addition by subtraction when they released former number 1 overall pick Jamarcus Russell. And in the Pacific Northwest, the Seahawks hit reset as well, bringing in legendary college coach Pete Carroll from USC to inject energy into a stale franchise. At the same time, the Bears went all in during free agency, namely their signing of 5-time Pro Bowl pass rusher Julius Peppers. And a new wave of quarterbacks began to arrive. The St. Louis Rams selected Sam Bradford with the first overall pick, and Tim Tebow brought national attention to Denver, even if his role remained unclear. But perhaps most impactful was the arrival of Ndamukong Suh in Detroit, a generational interior force expected to immediately transform the Lions' defense and single-handedly wreck games. The 2010 season opened with a rematch of the NFC Championship as the Saints hosted the Vikings. But what was supposed to be the continuation of a budding rivalry ended in a 14-9 Saints win, where the Vikings offense looked disjointed from the start, a trend that would continue throughout the month. New Orleans expectedly started 3-1, but now faced stiff competition from a rising Falcons team, who took them down in a Week 3 overtime bout and matched their 3-1 record through the first month. But the biggest story was in Philadelphia, where the Kevin Kolb plan lasted for about one half before Clay Matthews knocked him out, so Michael Vick stepped in and went 16 of 24 passing with over 100 yards rushing. Vick then took down Detroit in a Week 2 shootout, but in Week 3 against Jacksonville, he threw for nearly 300 yards, accounted for 4 touchdowns, and looked better than ever. A refined and evolved version compared to his Atlanta days, but with the same speed, improv, and rocket arm that could connect with DeSean Jackson from anywhere on the field. But just as quickly as it all came together, a rib injury in Week 4 sidelined Vick and would force Philly to turn back to Kevin Kolb in October. But while Philly was riding their emotional roller coaster, Kansas City was surprising the AFC. Just 4-12 in 2009, the Chiefs opened the season 3-0, with their defense holding opponents to 11 points per game, and Jamal Charles taking yet another step toward elite status after his Year 2 breakout. Meanwhile, the Steelers were doing exactly what they needed to do to survive without Ben Roethlisberger. They opened 3-1, grinding out low-scoring wins in the first 2 weeks before blowing out Tampa 38-13 in Week 3. Pittsburgh, looking this good without their most valuable player, was a scary proposition for the also 3-1 Ravens. But not everyone handled the opening months so well. The Cowboys immediately stumbled out of the gate with a sloppy Week 1 loss to Washington after a devastating holding penalty wiped the game-winning touchdown off the board. After losses to Chicago and Tennessee, the most hyped-up team in the NFC was 1-3. But speaking of Chicago, they ended September 3-1, behind stellar play from Jay Cutler, tied with Green Bay for the NFC North lead. And while established teams sorted themselves out, a new superstar had emerged in Houston. In Week 1, Arian Foster introduced himself to the league with a historic performance: 231 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns against the Colts, one of the greatest breakout games in NFL history. Foster continued his elite dual-threat production in the following weeks, transforming the Texans' offense into one of the most explosive units in the league with Matt Schaub and Andre Johnson. Houston was 3-1. And beginning a tense, season-long AFC East battle, the Jets handed the Patriots a 28-14 loss in Week 2. But both teams were 3-1 heading into October. During the month of October, Kevin Kolb went 2-1 as the starter for the Eagles, while Michael Vick healed. But more concerning for Philly was the Giants' undefeated October. Powered by a relentless pass rush and an offense that could score in bunches, they took over the NFC East lead. And their surge was highlighted by one of the most pivotal games of the season. In Week 7 on Monday night, the Giants and Cowboys traded blows in a 42-35 shootout that ended in a New York win. But more importantly, Tony Romo went down with a broken collarbone in the first half, pretty much closing the book on Dallas's young season, who ended October 1-6 with one of the league's worst defenses and John Kitna now under center. But with Ben Roethlisberger's return to the Steelers lineup in Week 6, he immediately reminded the league what it had been missing. He threw for 3 touchdowns and added 2 more the next week in back-to-back wins. With a defense that was already among the league's best, Pittsburgh was arguably the most complete team in football at 5-2. But Tom Brady might have had something to say about that. After a 41-14 victory over Miami, the Patriots traded a disgruntled and post-prime Randy Moss to the Vikings, and only got better from there, beating Baltimore in overtime, then San Diego and Minnesota to cap off a 5-game win streak and take a 1-game lead over the Jets, who ended their month by getting shut out 9-0 by the 5-3 Packers. And the NFC West was a sea of mediocrity, but one of the moves of the decade was made in early October, when the Seahawks acquired Buffalo Bills' 4th-year running back Marshawn Lynch for 2 draft picks. He immediately made his presence felt, running for 133 yards and a touchdown over his first 2 games in a Seahawk uniform, and helping them take the division lead at 4-3. On Monday Night Football in Week 10, the Eagles traveled to D.C. to face Donovan McNabb and the Redskins, which was already a compelling storyline with McNabb facing his former team and all, but what unfolded had nothing to do with him. On the very first offensive snap, Michael Vick launched the ball 63 yards in the air, hitting DeSean Jackson for an 88-yard touchdown. Vick accounted for 3 touchdowns in the first quarter alone, and by the end of the night, he had delivered one of the greatest quarterback performances in NFL history. Over 400 total yards, 4 touchdowns passing, and 2 rushing in a 59-28 demolition. A game so defeating that Albert Haynesworth decided to stop playing. For anyone left doubting, Vick reintroduced himself to America in prime time by utterly dominating a division rival. 1 week later, they beat the Giants to take the NFC East lead, and Vick was an MVP candidate. But the Patriots' defining moment, oddly enough, was an embarrassing Week 9 blowout loss to the Browns, where Peyton Hillis continued to grow his legend by rushing for 184 yards and 2 touchdowns. But after that, the Pats won out through the rest of the month, 9-2 after beating the Steelers, Lions, and Colts, who were falling apart in front of everyone's eyes. After losing tight end Dallas Clark for the season back in October, November turned into one of the most uncharacteristic stretches of the Peyton Manning era. From weeks 9 through 13, the Colts lost 4 of 5 games to the Eagles, Pats, Chargers, and worst of all, a week 13 overtime loss to the 3-8 Cowboys where Peyton threw 4 interceptions. At 6-6, the Colts were no longer the surefire contender they'd been for a decade, but you knew better than to count them out as long as they had 18 at the helm. However, the Jaguars were actually the ones atop the AFC South. After a couple huge games from Maurice Jones-Drew and a Hail Mary overtime win over Houston. But as hot as the Patriots were, the Jets stayed with them stride for stride, winning a trio of uber-dramatic games that included Santonio Holmes' game winners in back-to-back weeks. New York was 9-2. But there wasn't any separation in the AFC North either. The Steelers got away with one in Week 12 when Stevie Johnson dropped the game-winning touchdown, leading to them and the Ravens each sitting at 8-3 heading into their Week 13 Sunday night showdown in Baltimore, which had the potential to ultimately decide the division, a showdown that Pittsburgh would win after a go-ahead Isaac Redmond touchdown with 3 minutes left. But something similar was happening in the NFC South, where the 9-2 Falcons and 8-3 Saints each went undefeated in November, as hot as any teams in the NFL. However, they wouldn't face off again until Week 16. And yet another undefeated November squad was the Bears, stacking wins behind their elite defense, a defense that shut out Miami in Week 11. At 8-3, they were one win ahead of the 7-4 Packers, who ended the month with a close loss to Atlanta, but prior to that, Aaron Rodgers had stomped the Cowboys 45-7 and then threw 4 touchdowns against the Vikings, who were never able to right the ship and now sat outside the playoff picture at 4-7. But the most important moment of the month for the Lions was Calvin Johnson's touchdown that wasn't. And even though Kansas City was still clinging to the AFC West lead, up from the ashes rose the San Diego Chargers, winners of 4 straight, averaging 31 points per game in November, and Phillip Rivers had multiple 4-touchdown games this month, in the midst of his 3rd consecutive MVP caliber campaign. In Week 13, the Patriots made the most emphatic statement of the entire season. Hosting the Jets, who'd spent months talking, competing, and positioning themselves as equals, Tom Brady carved through their defense with ease, throwing 4 touchdowns, while Mark Sanchez ended his day with 3 picks in a 45-3 loss. New York went 2-3 in their final 5 games, and New England ended the year on an 8-game winning streak, with the top offense in football. Tom Brady was named both MVP and Offensive Player of the Year, not having turned the ball over once since Week 6, and Belichick was Coach of the Year. But the Eagles' offense too remained nearly impossible to contain. After kicking off the month with 2 big wins against Houston and Dallas, they traveled to the Meadowlands for their most important game of the year. You may know that game as the Miracle at the New Meadowlands. The Eagles fell behind 31-10 with 8 minutes left before Michael Vick authored 3 rapid touchdown drives. With just seconds remaining, the Giants inexplicably punted to DeSean Jackson, who initially bobbled it, then cut up the field and outran everyone for a walk-off touchdown as time expired. In a matter of minutes, a blowout loss had turned into a 38-31 victory. The Eagles would lose their final 2 games, but the Miracle at the New Meadowlands was enough to take the division crown and stop the Giants from making the playoffs. Plus, Michael Vick was the comeback player of the year. And in the South, Atlanta and New Orleans went head-to-head in Week 16. On Monday night, Drew Brees found Jimmy Graham for the game-winning touchdown with 3 minutes left to move within 1 game of the Falcons heading into Week 17. But a 31-10 win over Carolina clinched the South for Atlanta and locked the Saints into the wildcard round. The Bears had controlled the NFC North for most of the season, but the Packers never went away. Chicago had already won the division after high-scoring wins over the Jets and Vikings, but Green Bay had a chance to show what they were capable of in Week 17. They didn't exactly do that, beating the Bears just 10-3 at Lambeau, but Aaron Rodgers was headed to the postseason for the second time nonetheless. Elsewhere in the NFC North, a shoulder injury ended Brett Favre's streak of 297 consecutive starts on December 13th. The 12-4 Ravens won their final 4 games, but it wasn't enough to make up for their Week 13 loss to Pittsburgh. who held the 12-4 tiebreaker and had the Defensive Player of the Year in Troy Polamalu. However, Baltimore would have a chance at a rubber match in January. And in the AFC West, the Chiefs also held on to win the division at 10-6, though the Chargers made it interesting, especially when they shut out Kansas City 31-0 in Week 14. But despite going 7-2 down the stretch, the Chargers, with their second-ranked offense and top 10 defense, were left out of the playoffs at 9-7. The 4-12 Broncos didn't have much doing in 2010, but they did have one of the most random receiving champions of all time in Brandon Lloyd, who led the league with 1,448 yards. And then there was the NFC West, by far the strangest and worst division in football. Entering Week 17, the Seahawks and Rams faced off in a winner-take-all matchup for the right to exist in the postseason. Seattle entered 6-9 and St. Louis 7-8. Just one touchdown and 5 total field goals were scored, but Seattle defeated the Rams 16-6 to claim the division title. It was one of the most unusual playoff entries in league history, a losing team hosting the defending champion Saints. On the bright side for the Rams, Sam Bradford was the Offensive Rookie of the Year, while Ndamukong Suh won Defensive Rookie of the Year, marking the second time in NFL history the top 2 picks each took home the awards. Arian Foster finished the year as the NFL's rushing leader, completing one of the most unexpected campaigns of the century. And Andre Johnson continued to show why he was quietly the best receiver in the NFL with another dominant season. But Houston finished third in division behind the Jags and Colts, who won their final 4 games to finish 10-6 and win the AFC South. Their offense was top 5 per usual, but the 23rd ranked defense was going to be difficult to overcome. And the most notable moment of the Titans season was Cortland Finnegan getting whooped by Andre Johnson. The Saints built an early lead and swapped scores in a high-scoring first half, but Seattle kept responding behind Matt Hasselbeck's 4 touchdowns. After New Orleans rallied late, Marshawn Lynch buried them with his legendary 67-yard beast Quake to seal one of the all-time upsets, 41-36. Next, in a defensive stalemate between the Colts and Jets, Peyton Manning broke through with a 57-yard touchdown to Pierre Garçon before 2 LaDainian Tomlinson touchdowns for New York. Adam Vinatieri kicked a late go-ahead field goal, but the Jets answered with a final drive to set up a game-winning field goal as time expired. On Sunday, Kansas City struck first with a 41-yard Jamal Charles touchdown, but Baltimore wasn't fazed and completely dominated from that point on, holding the Chiefs scoreless the rest of the game and piling on points in a one-sided second-half rout, 30-7. And finally, Aaron Rodgers' efficient play and a 123-yard rushing performance from James Starks put Green Bay in control against the Eagles, who did come back, driving toward the red zone in the final minute, but an interception ended the comeback attempt and their storied season 21-16. At Heinz Field, turnovers and defensive chaos helped Baltimore surge to a 21-7 lead. But the Steelers' takeaway-filled third quarter tied the game before a 58-yard pass to Antonio Brown set up the go-ahead score, punctuating a hard-fought comeback win 31-24. Next, Atlanta jumped out to a 14-7 lead with a 102-yard kickoff return touchdown, but Green Bay proceeded to squash them, as Aaron Rodgers played a near-perfect game, accounting for 4 touchdowns, while the defense forced 4 turnovers, including a pick-6 on the final play of the first half, as the Packers overwhelmed the top seed 48-21. In Chicago, Jay Cutler hit explosives early and built a 4-score lead with a pair of his own rushing touchdowns. Seattle scored a few garbage-time TDs, but the deficit proved too large as the Bears won convincingly 35-24. And lastly, the Jets took a 14-3 lead in Foxborough after a Tom Brady interception and Braylon Edwards touchdown. New England fought back to close the gap, but the Jets answered every push, capitalizing on mistakes and finishing the stunning upset with a late touchdown, 28-21. Traveling to Soldier Field, Green Bay took a 14-0 lead in the second quarter as their defense stymied Chicago, and Jay Cutler exited with a knee injury. Despite Bears backup Caleb Haney making it a 1-score game with under 5 minutes left, the Packers defense caught the game-ending interception on Haney's next drive. With superb defense and timely offense, Green Bay completed an unbelievable run through the NFC's top 3 seeds to reach Super Bowl 45. And in the AFC, Pittsburgh ended most of the suspense in the first half, taking a 24-0 lead with a minute left in the second quarter after a Sanchez fumble was returned for a touchdown. However, a 45-yard Santonio Holmes TD, Roethlisberger safety, and Jericho Cotchery score cut the deficit to 1 possession with 3 minutes left, though the Steelers would pick up a pair of first downs, and Big Ben kneeled out the clock to punch a ticket to his 3rd Super Bowl appearance. Super Bowl 45 scoring kicked off with Aaron Rodgers leading an 80-yard drive, capped by a 29-yard touchdown to Jordy Nelson. Moments later, a costly mistake by Big Ben resulted in a pick six, giving Green Bay a 14-0 lead after scoring 2 touchdowns in 17 seconds of game time. Pittsburgh would settle in with a field goal and Hines Ward touchdown in the second quarter, but in between those was another Rodgers touchdown to Greg Jennings, making it 21-10 at half. And neither team was at full health. In the first half alone, the Packers lost Charles Woodson and Donald Driver, while Big Ben and Troy Polamalu were both playing injured for Pittsburgh. In the second half, though, the Steelers engineered a methodical first drive, ended by a Rashard Mendenhall touchdown that made it 21-17. The Steelers' defense followed it with a key stop, but missed opportunities, including a failed 52-yard field goal, hurt their chances. Then, on the first play of the fourth quarter, a Mendenhall fumble gave Green Bay the ball at their own 45, and Rodgers capitalized, finding Greg Jennings for another touchdown to extend the lead 28-17. Pittsburgh refused to lay down, however. Roethlisberger responded with a crisp possession and a 25-yard Mike Wallace touchdown before a successful 2-point conversion cut it to 28-25. But with the game tightening, Rodgers came through in the biggest moment, leading a clutch drive highlighted by a 31-yard completion to Jennings. The Steelers held them to a field goal, but Green Bay extended the lead to 31-25 with just over 2 minutes on the clock. That left Big Ben one final chance. Starting deep in his own territory, he completed to Heath Miller to move the chains, but the drive quickly stalled. Under pressure, his final 3 passes fell incomplete, ending Pittsburgh's comeback attempt. Rodgers took a knee to secure the victory and finished with an MVP performance, throwing for 304 yards and 3 touchdowns. And despite a valiant second-half effort, the Steelers were undone by their own mistakes, never once holding a lead. For Green Bay, it marked the culmination of an improbable postseason run as a 6th seed, defeating 3 straight higher-seeded teams on the road before capturing the championship.